Hi, everyone. Welcome to another discussion session right here at the APVA Awards 2024. It's a pleasure to be your host. My name is T Code. I'm the creative partner right here at APVA. I'm also a voiceover artist and a podcaster. So it's my pleasure to talk about some podcast related issues with another African podcast maestro. He is definitely one of those people who you should look out for when it comes to podcasting in Africa because he is the CEO of Africa Podcast Network, is the CEO of InBroadcasting, Podcasting Strategist, and he's also the co-founder of AMPD Studios, all the way from the city of Cape Town in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Savage. Hi, John.
Hey, hello, Tico. Thanks for having me. An honor to be here. And yeah, it's cool what you guys are doing.
I mean, it's an honor to have you too, John. I mean, you're not a small person in the industry. From your bio, I could see that you're the creator of AMPD Studios and the director of the MTV-based partnership. That's the AMPD Studios Live. So, wow, it's an honor to talk to you, John.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So, guys, today we're going to be looking at the topic from local to global, how African podcasters can reach a wider audience. And you would agree with me that there's no other person to talk about such a topic with than John Savage. And John has a lot of experience in the podcast world as the CEO of Africa Podcast Network. So, let's get right into it. But I'll start with a question, though, more like an icebreaker, John. You are the CEO of Africa Podcast Network, and I've seen that you had some history with the broadcast industry before you moved into the podcast space. So, what inspired your migration, or would I say, just getting into that space to sort of make podcasting better for Africans?
Thank you for that question. I mean, for me, I feel like I was like born and bred in podcasting because I started podcasting 2009.
Wow.
This was something I really wanted to do, and it was way too early. I didn't think it was going to be like a big business concept. I was just absolutely obsessed with podcasting, and I started podcasting in 2014. I started a podcasting network, but it was so early, and it just didn't work because it was just too early, and it's taken so many years for sort of the rest of the world to catch up. But in the meantime, I mean, my whole sort of I want to say career, but life has been an obsession with content creating and music, or music, not both of them. And I have had a career in music and a career in content creation. I wanted to be a film director when I was a kid, and I made some films, and I still and so like television was always there, but I never loved TV. What I loved was creating um, amazing and different content that didn't really fit into the mainstream. And then I think that's what made podcasting so attractive to me, and YouTube and these alternate sources, because it opened the door for anyone from anywhere to tell stories. And that really is my attraction to the media. I didn't go into podcasting or like make any shift. It's almost as if when podcasting came around, I just felt this was made for me.
Wow. Well, that's beautiful to know that you've been about 15 years neck deep into podcasting, and you're one of those who started podcasting early, 2009. That's 15
I can't,
years.
is that 15 years ago? How can that be? Is that right?
I mean, this is 2024. All
What?
right.
Where did life go?
But kudos to you, man. I mean, you've done a lot. A lot of people get into podcasting, and the first 3 months they burn out. They run out of the ability or capacity to continue. But you've been doing this for over a decade, so you're the best person to tell us how to weather the storms and also how to expand and reach a wider and global audience. So let's start with some top strategies that you would advise podcasters, local podcasters, to explore in the goal to reach a wider audience, right? So we want to be global. We want to have more people listen to us, even in the local territory. You want more Africans listening to you, or you want in your own space, if it's South Africa, you want more people all over the country to listen to your podcast. What are the strategies that we can explore as podcasters to get that global reach?
It's such a complicated question, and I kind of have two. I'm gonna leave the global one for the as the third answer, but there's kind of two things here.
Yeah.
There are ways for growth. There are ways to assist with growth, and building a podcast is like rolling a snowball. It's very slow. It's like if you can try and remember when you first started an Instagram account, how hard it is to build, and there aren't really a lot of shortcuts. You need time, you need patience, and there are growth strategies that you can implement. And we experiment with them quite a lot, and they do work. But that's kind of a piece of the puzzle only. Podcasting has kind of migrated, even though Spotify only sort of came to Africa in 2018. We're relatively new to podcasting on the continent, but we have had a meteoric rise. We are globally looked at as like a massive rise in podcasting. And so we've already moved quickly through the phase where it's easy to get in and easy to get big because there aren't many podcasts out there, to it's a highly competitive market. And the question you're asking is like, how do you make your podcast stand out? And I think from what I'm looking at, like the podcasts that do really well are when the person who started the podcast isn't starting it strategically and going like, I'm going to interview celebrities because look what Macchi's done and look what Joe Rogan's done, or I'm going to do business advice because that's what Vusi Tembakwayo does, or those podcasts that they already exist. It's like saying, well, I'm gonna dance like Michael Jackson. You never be Michael Jackson because you're impersonating him, right? The podcasts that are getting so much traction are driven by people with a real passion for exploring either storytelling or something that they genuinely feel there is a need in the market, that there's nothing there for them. So they're like fulfilling the need for themselves and therefore for other people. And it constantly surprises me how many new podcasts are coming into the market and dominating. And it shows that there are lots of gaps in the market. Like I don't think there's enough sports podcasts in Africa, but the audience level says there's a huge demand for it and brands want to work in that space. So where are those podcasters who are just passionate about sport and they're not doing like a traditional sports show? They only like a particular cool thing about sport, and then they start a podcast out of passion. And those are the podcasts I'm finding a lot easier to work with. They have a lot more growth and scope. Because I think making sure you're not copying what is out there is the first point. The second thing is consistency. This is the key to podcasts. It's this consistent, everything in the digital space. You get punished by any algorithm if you're not consistently putting out episodes. And this brings me on to the point that you originally said is like, why do people burn out in podcasting? And that is because their expectations are too high and they're starting with too much production. When you start a podcast, it's really important that you consider your 100th episode. And why you need to consider your 100th episode, because you've got to prepare your mind that your concept has to be long tail enough to reach 100 episodes, that you're going to have to sit and put together 100 episodes. You need the time and the effort to be able to do that, because podcasts only generally start to get traction after the 3-month period. So if you are after 3 months expecting to have an audience, and particularly if you're a celebrity, it doesn't matter if you've got 1 million followers on Twitter when you start. That doesn't help you in podcasting space, as we've seen time and time again of failed podcasts. So you've got to have the endurance and the passion to keep driving because you really believe in what you're doing. And that's the unfortunate reality of it. Then to your final question about the international market. So I've been doing a lot of traveling around the world investigating this, and there are huge opportunities actually for Africa, because there are so many brands trying to get into Africa and partners trying to get into Africa, and they can't find reliable partners and they can't find the right podcasters to work with. So if you're aiming at a global audience, it's the best time to do it. I think in terms of strategy, a lot of podcasts on our continent are doing really well, but are totally insular in the sense that, and it's been required, it's the sense that they are talking to their target market in their home territory, and that's great. You need that. But they
Yeah.
don't open, if you're speaking your own languages or only interviewing people from your own community, that's great for audience growth in that community. But you need, if you put on the lens that other people are wanting to understand your country or your subject matter, and you actually open up how you are conveying that message, you're actually opening up opportunities for international, for cross collaboration. And this is a new thing we're starting to talk to. So we're talking to some of the biggest podcasters in the world. And we like the Jordan Harbinger in America or the Goal Hanger guys in the UK and Europe, and say, and all very interested. Why don't we do a cross collaboration where one of our podcasts speaks to you and one of your podcasts speak to us? It's insightful for both. You're introducing you to other markets. And so, and it's not like we are like geniuses or have access to these people. Everyone has that access in this day and age. And I think it's about understanding that there's a global marketplace. We're very insular in Africa. We see ourselves as quite a closed environment, and for good reason. It's not often that these international collaborations happen, but I think the environment is ripe for it. And the interest is in it. We just need people to actually reach out and start making those connections. Wow, that was a super long answer to your question. Sorry.
But I really did enjoy it because you said a lot of points that made so much sense. You talked about how we should, if you're just starting a podcast, think about the 100th episode, because you want to make sure that you stand the test of time. You should also consider, taking it bit by bit and not putting all your, overly very expensive budgets into your podcast production, and a couple of things that you mentioned. And that got me thinking about, how do we define a so-called standard podcast that will appeal to the international market? Okay, so you're talking about collaboration with big podcasters, globally. So I'm curious to understand how we can be on that level of standard. Well, let's try to do something. Let's try to define what the standard podcast that can appeal to the international market is. Can we try that? So, and in this trying to define that, I'm looking forward to you talking about perhaps, how consistent the podcast should air. Also trying to tackle the subject matter of video and audio podcasting. I mean, do we necessarily have to be a video podcast to be able to enjoy that international reach, right? And other things like, could one also succeed being an indie podcaster, or belonging or working with a network, a podcast network like yours, to get that international reach properly? So I know this is like three questions in one, but it's all in the attempt to define what a standard podcast is.
Okay. First of all, you don't need to be part of a network. Absolutely. That is not a requirement at all. The second piece of it is, it's my opinion that video is integral, particularly in Africa. We love YouTube more than anything else on the planet. YouTube is our thing, right? And before even Spotify and Apple and the audio side. And what's interesting is that the rest of the world a podcast has really been an audio thing, and is now very quickly moving into a audio and video thing. In Africa, we actually kind of started on YouTube, and then when Spotify came, migrated into audio. And a lot of the podcasts we're working with, even though the audio is a very big component and we make a lot of revenue for audio for our podcasters, the numbers and the engagement on the video components are often 2 times, 3 times, 5 times higher. So I recommend that YouTube is a very important part of being a podcaster in this day and age, particularly if you're on this continent. In terms of subject, I'll give you a really cool example. I'm working with this guy called Josh Rubin. It's called the Wide Awake Podcast. Now, he was starting to do, it just is like a completely interesting character who's obsessed with storytelling, who was telling these stories, and his podcast started to get traction. So he went to America for 3 months, thinking he was going to move there. And when he
Mm,
got there, he went like, you know what is interesting? Every story has been told out here.
mm,
So he moved back. And now he is telling these extremely unique stories about South Africa that are no one has heard in the international market, and he is killing it. I
mm,
mean, he is telling the stories of these inside stories of South Africa that he knows is going to appeal to the global market and that also appeals to us. And he's on a par with the biggest podcasters that I know in terms of when he drops an episode, how quickly they go viral internationally. And so that's the subject matter piece of it. And then the final piece is like how does one reach out to podcasters? Well, all the podcasters are in the world are in the kind of same boat. And if you have a podcast that's talking about, I don't know, uh, I don't know, hip hop in Kenya, or maybe let's call it Nigerian Amapiano, let's call it, or so it doesn't even have to be music. Then to
yeah.
understand who in the international world are the podcasters who would be interested in those conversations of which you're an expert and they're not, that will feed into, you'll add value to their podcast and you can add value to to yours. And I think if you're strategic and smart about that, you'll find loads. And maybe it won't be the biggest podcasts in the world, but even if you find a mid-level podcast and you're a mid-level podcast and you cross collaborate, what you've done now is added 5,000 listens from your region to his podcast and 5,000 listens from Romania to your podcast. And then that now you're talking about like growing your podcast into the international arena. And I think it's just about being aware and I think Josh is such a great example, is aware that he's telling these
Mm,
stories that are going to have global appeal in a way that's still local, that's about his home culture, about things that he's passionate about. That's the kind of secret sauce.
mm. Wow. That's interesting. From local to global, how African podcasters can reach a wider audience. That's the topic for anyone who's just joining. And I've got John Savage, who's been speaking with me about this topic for a couple of minutes now. He just answered the question about how we can define what a standard podcast is that will meet the international appeal. And some of the things that John said so far are quite interesting to me, talking about how it talked about using or selecting unique topics that aren't really everywhere and everybody's talking about, right? Stories that are unique to you and appeal. Also talking about how you can collaborate. And I think that's a very strong point. And consistency is another strong point that John just shared with us. And we just touched on involving video in our podcast. And I like how you said it, John, that here in Africa, we're so in love with YouTube. And for me, I think that then begins to explain how video podcast has taken such a huge attention in Africa. Now, on a final note, before we round off this conversation, I know you've been into podcasting for, like I said, over a decade, but one of the challenges we still have as African podcasters is the issue of monetization. So when we're talking about going from local to global, so when we're talking about going from local to global in the podcasting world, we cannot shy away from the fact that it takes a lot of investment. You need to fund. You need, from just going solo to having a team of people that can help you if you're doing video, the branding side of it, the reaching out, and a couple of things like that. So from your perspective, how do you think we can leverage, or what strategies can we leverage on to ensure monetization to hit that target?
Okay, first of all, I disagree with the premise. I don't think
Mm,
you need anything to be a great podcaster. I take Josh as an example again,
okay.
just because he shoots himself, he does the stuff himself, he does the audio himself, he's in it, he edits it himself. So it is time consuming to do it that way. But the secret to launching a podcast is to do it within the resources that you have. Once you start
Mm,
spending money on a podcast that isn't monetized, you're in deep trouble because that's how you're going to guarantee failure. You need to set up a podcast with the resources you have, whether it's your phone, you've got a SM7B Shure over there, but I'm telling you, most of these of our smartphones have got really strong mics and compressors built on them. There's free software to download. There's a lot of ways to do stuff really free, and you need to create, especially if you're starting, you've got to create an infrastructure that you can sustain, which means it's got to cost you as little as possible. Maybe you have to invest in one or two small pieces of gear to make your life easier. But it's kind of like if you're a tech startup, you need what is called an MVP. You need to have something, a minimum viable product in the market to gauge a response, and understand what the analytics and understand that there's a market and get your passion out there and see that people. And once you get to that phase, then you could go, right now, I feel that it's worthwhile, like stepping up a level. Now I'm going to get a better mic. Now I'm going to do a thing. So that is just sort of, I don't think there's any barrier of entries. If you've got a good idea and you're passionate about it, nothing should stop you. But onto the more serious question, monetization is an issue, but you got to remember podcasting is a fledgling market. And what's happened in the last 18 months is like 100 years in any other business. And monetization in podcasting has only just begun. Literally, I would say like in the last 6 months, virtually. And so it's new. We're seeing huge growth in revenue at the moment. I mean, astronomical. It's a fledgling business that in the commercial environment's just getting started. So it's a good time to be in podcasting. There is revenue starting to get into podcasting. There are a lot of more brands around the continent who are wanting to work in the space. The problem is infrastructure, and why we built the Africa Podcast Network is to try and help with infrastructure, to say like, if Coca-Cola wants to work in podcasting in Africa, where do they go? At the moment, they have to go and Google what podcasts are working in Kenya and Ivory Coast and Ghana and try and DM them. And sometimes they don't check their DM. And most of the time, they probably don't get back to them. So there's a problem with just like infrastructure that allows brands to get more involved, and that's why we created APN, to be a really easy way for brands to say, I want to work with podcasts, and we'll say, all right, well, let's facilitate them. And we often work with podcasts that are not even signed to us, because what we're trying to do is open a community of podcasters to be able to start earning revenue together. It is tough. Like a lot of the good podcasters, their kind of stable diet is on YouTube pre-roll monetization, which isn't a lot. If you are doing YouTube, getting views in America, you'll earn 3-4 times that amount for the same amount of viewers. So you get paid a lot less in Africa. For a viewer in Africa is a lot less than in America. But in the audio side, we're seeing so much traction in the audio side. In fact, I think we're generating on a par, if not more, revenue for our podcasters in the audio side. And that's because it's coming now. It's coming. So it's a really good time to be in podcasting, to hang on for dear life, and to grow your audience, because it's starting to come together. And that's, you don't have to be a podcaster. I mean, part of a network. You can be completely independent. But you need to ask yourself, when brand A is trying to find your podcast, how do they find you? And that's the only value add really that being associated with a network helps with, but it's not mandatory. If you've got a good sales team, or you're really proactive and you're out there, you'll get the sales yourself.
Wow. I feel like I just went through a masterclass with John Savage. And thank you so much, John, for taking time to, share these beautiful ideas with us about how people can, go from local to global. And I really did enjoy it, because for one, I learned personally, I've been able to demystify certain things and reorganize my mind. I don't necessarily need a hefty budget to go global, as long as I have the right story to tell and I can keep being consistent and, ensure that the quality is there. I'm open to collaboration. I'm proactive, able to respond to brands when they reach out. I feel that's good enough. If I can also include videos to my podcast, that makes it even much better. And these and many things are stuff that John has shared with us today. I'm very, very excited and happy to listen to you today. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, Tico. It's been a pleasure meeting you, and good luck with the rest of everything.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. We just had this conversation with the CEO of Africa Podcast Network, John Savage. Just before we go, John, how can people connect with you or what you do, which is the Africa Podcast Network, if they need to?
Either I'm on Instagram at John Savage, and I do a lot of podcasting advice, tips, and anything you need, and answer a lot of Qs there. Otherwise, I'm on an email called info@africapodcastnetwork.com.
Great. info@africapodcastnetwork.com. Thank you so much. All right, guys, let's get back to the rest of the APVA Awards 2024. I am T Code, and I'll see you some other time. Bye for now.